Mr. McCabe, thank you so much for being with ERT tonight. Let me ask you, what brings a young American in the 50s to Greece?
With hindsight, I wish I could say it was my own volition, but it was really as a result of my older brother, Charles, having a Greek friend, Petros, here in Athens. And Petros invited us to come for 2 weeks to Greece that summer. I was just tagging along. Greece wasn't on my agenda at all. And after 2 weeks here, or less than 2 weeks, we decided to cancel the rest of our program for the summer. We had plans to go to Egypt, to Italy, to France. We canceled it all and we spent the entire summer in Greece.
What was the hook? What captured your imagination? What captured your soul?
It was the Aegean Sea, the mountains, the friendliness of the people. It was a lot of things. And I had just gotten a new Rolleiflex, so in part it was the photo opportunities that I saw were so amazing that it was easy to make the decision to stay.
Do you remember Greece in the 50s? It was a poor country. What was the people like? What was the whole atmosphere like? The country had just entered its post-war era. What was the whole atmosphere here?
Well, let me start with Athens and then go on to the countryside. Athens really showed signs of poverty. We started our first night at the Grand Bretagne Hotel where our friend Petros had made reservations, but we saw it was 200 drachmas a night, or almost $7. So after one night, we moved to Ammonia, which was more of the real Athens of the time. But the Athens that I remember that era had no traffic lights. There was a law against using horns, so people would bang on the roof of their car in lieu of a horn. The traffic policemen were very, very rare. There was one at Ammonia, there was one at Syntagma in front of the GB. But there were signs of poverty everywhere, and as you got into the countryside, of course, we saw, and I have many pictures of women doing their laundry in cisterns, in rivers, in wells, of donkeys were in wide use in the islands. There were no cars, no electricity, no television, no internet, and very often we were the only tourists on an island, which was amazing because there was such a curiosity and sense of hospitality toward the foreign visitor. And you would be given sweets and water and then asked a million questions about, first of all, how you got the money to travel, because the people weren't traveling very much. And secondly, where you were going, what were you up to. But it was a time that you saw a side of Greece, of course, that you don't see today, because being the only visitor on an island was a remarkable thing. I remember in the 60s, we were traveling with our doctor from New York, and we decided to go to Ios on my brother's recommendation. He said it's a completely unspoiled island. So we took the boat from Santorini north and arrived there. There were 5 French tourists on the island. My brother got upset. He said, let's leave. He literally wanted to leave because he considered the island overrun with tourists, although there were only 5. I might add that the mayor of Ios at the time, whose name I don't remember, actually gave his bedroom and his bed to the doctor we were traveling with, which was a wonderful gesture and unforgettable.
You're referring to some elements of the Greek identity. I mean, you mentioned hospitality right now. And I wonder whether you sense that over the course of the years, you think that the Greek society retains the basic elements of this identity?
Well, it certainly does in the countryside. I don't think I ever really saw it in Athens, except in the circle of friends that we developed at the time. But in the countryside, you go to villages and even villages with tourists, you sense a genuine sense of hospitality there. But no longer the curiosity about the foreigner, that rare foreigner who came along. That of course, they don't question you anymore. And in many cases, there's a commercial relationship between the visitor and the person they're dealing with.
And after your first trip to Greece in the 1950s, you kept on coming and coming and coming. How did this relationship evolve over the years?
Well, and my brother too was accompanying me on many of these trips. I came in 54 for the first time, then in 55, 56 I think I missed it. 57 I came at the request of the National Geographic Society to photograph in the Cyclades. And basically after that, I would say I was here essentially every year.
Mm-hmm.
So
I have a question.
It was like an addiction.
True, it makes sense after so many years. Now, being a foreigner, being somebody who's coming from abroad, do you think it helps you depict through your camera lens things that we take for granted in this country?
I definitely think that's an element. Although in the post-war era there was some very, very talented Greek photographers, and they certainly showed the way of life in the country in Iperos, etc., Balafas, Touloupas. But I had the privilege of really visiting many different parts of the country, so I have had a greater variety of exposure to these things. And of course, when you see children in Mykonos filling deneke, a bucket with water to bring home, that's something that we didn't see in the suburbs of New York City, where we had, of course, running water. So I think one is naturally attracted to the unknown, the unexpected, the new. That was definitely part of.
What do you sense Greece was relevant in the 50s and the 60s, say for a New Yorker, say for an American who would live in New York, Florida, Chicago? What was so important for them to understand Greece at that time?
Well, there were certainly three things at least. One with the antiquities, which we didn't have in the New York area, and secondly was the people and the friendliness of the people, and third was the physical environment, if you will. I grew up on what was called Milton Point in Rye, New York, and it was a peninsula jutting out into Long Island Sound. If you saw the color of Long Island Sound, which you probably are familiar with since you live near the Hudson River, you'd realize that the Aegean is in a whole different category of beauty. And the combination of the mountains and the sea, the Aegean Sea, was unique. Where I lived was very flat land. So those were some of the elements. But also I'd say the photo opportunities, because I got in this rut thinking I would come back every year for the rest of my life photographing these same scenes and same way of life in different parts of the country. But then in the late 60s, the 70s, the 80s, things began to change very dramatically.
For some reason, I wonder, you were referring to Mykonos a while ago, and the way, of course, the island looked like back in the 50s. I wonder now that Mykonos is the success story of the Greek tourism product, whether you sense that the people who visit it do get the sense, the pure essence of Greece, do get the idea, the spirit, the zeitgeist, the whole idea of what Hellenism stands for.
I doubt it very much. I think that there is still, and this goes back 2-3 years ago, my last visit to Mykonos, there was still enormous hospitality. But when I first went there in 1955, someone told me about a panegyri, what I thought was anomeria, but it was just that the bus said anomeria that I took there. It was the monastery, Pandelimon Monastery, and there was a baptism and a festival on the saint's name day, which I guess is late July. And I, of course, was the only foreigner there, but they were flying an American flag among several other flags. And the priest, knowing that I was a foreigner, paid enormous attention to making sure that I knew where the food was, and he brought me a fresh glass of wine every few minutes, it seemed. So there was a great deal of hospitality. Today, I suspect that the Saint's Name Day there has many, many tourists, and while it's still celebrated and still celebrated by the locals, that it must have an entirely different flavor. Mm-hmm. I'm going to get a lot of criticism for saying that from friends in Mykonos who will say that it's celebrated just the way it was. But I think with many visitors there, it's very likely to be quite different.
No, I think point's taken. Doing some research on your background, I realized you did an extensive search on Lord Byron, who was the most iconic Phil-Hellene in maybe 2 centuries ago. I wonder what content you find today on the term Phil-Hellenism.
Let me back up and just say that the reason I wrote about Lord Byron is very interesting. When I got back from Greece on my first trip, I was just entering my junior year at Princeton, and I immediately went to the classics department and said I'd like to switch from the English department to the classics department. And they saw that I had done very well in Latin, but I'd never taken ancient Greek, so I was rejected. Today, of course, you don't need to know Latin, you don't need to know Greek to enter the Princeton Classics department. So I remained in the English department, but I tried to find a subject for my thesis relating to Greece. And Lord Byron was the obvious choice, a very easy choice. Mm-hmm. So I wrote my thesis on Lord Byron and Greece and his role in the Greek Revolution. Mm-hmm.
Going back to my question, what connotation do you give to the term Phil-Hellenism today?
Well, I think it's very, very different than it was in the 19th century, where you had to be prepared to give your life if you were a Phil-Hellene. Today, I think Greece has developed a circle of admirers throughout the world in many different countries who have a love for the people, for the history of the country, for the antiquities, for the Aegean Sea, for the islands. It's a very different kind of Phil-Hellenism, but I think it's perhaps maybe not equally strong, but it has a very great strength to it.
Mm-hmm. And to sum this up, do you sense that in a globalized society, Greece still retains its unique characteristics, even in the third decade of the 21st century?
I think so. I think it always will. Sure, there are other places in the world with sun and sea and beautiful topography, but the history of Greece and the fact that the people in Athens are speaking the same language they spoke 3,000 or more years ago gives it a unique depth of character that you don't find elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Finally, if I were to ask you, do you have any, say, favorite photos from your collection? Say that.
I do. I've developed some that I consider favorite, either because of the composition or the subject matter, or both. I could.
And you want to say a few words about them?
Well, one of them, and one that is quite well known because the Benaki Museum made a poster of it, is the photograph of the two men sitting in the coffee shop in Yalos, in the port of Fira, having their coffee while the Aegean is moored outside. The Aegean was kind of symbolic of the ships that traveled in the Aegean in the 1950s and 60s. It was built the same year as the Titanic in the UK, 1911, and it looked it, and it had served as a cruise ship at one point, and had been then transformed into a passenger liner. But very few ships were that old and that you saw in the Aegean, but there were many ships that were pre-war. It was always interesting when you got on board a ship to go to the islands, to go down and find the original nameplate of the ship and see where it was built. Many of them were built in Northern Europe. But one of the most famous of the ships, the Despina, which was affectionately called Despinaki and sailed in the Cyclades, was actually built for the US Navy in my hometown, Chicago, during the war, and was given to the British, given back to the Americans, given to the Greeks, and auctioned off for passenger liner use. So that photograph, and I know I'm being long-winded, kind of shows the coffee shop life of the era, the port of Santorini, and this old ship which was symbolic of so many other ships that traveled in the Aegean.
All right. Thank you very much for having this conversation with us tonight.
Thank you.